Hi Roger.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Good.
So we're here in Dublin.
We're inside Trinity College.
So what's it like being vegan in Dublin?
It's pretty good. It's improving, put it that way. It's not comparable with, say, England. In fact, I know somebody who did a podcast in Ireland, and then they moved to Birmingham, and they thought it was kind of vegan heaven compared. But I take a long view of it in the sense that I was vegan since '79, and so it's obviously vastly improved since then. There's still a lot to be done. Shamefully, we don't have a vegan restaurant in Ireland at all, which is a real shame. In fact, although I think there is a kind of cafe stroke restaurant who might have a 3-month contract at the moment. So there are moves for it, and there was a raw vegan restaurant in Temple Bar, but that was kind of too expensive, and it's a little bit what I would call, I'm pretty kind of down to earth Yorkshire guy, but so it was a bit kind of food, the drizzle stuff and all that, so it's very kind of the kind of stuff that I wouldn't go for. I never even went, But so there are some moves. I know there were some people from London talking about opening a vegan restaurant, but I think that might have fallen through. So there are things developing, but it's kind of following on from England, definitely, and certainly the United States.
Yeah. How do you think we can promote veganism more in Dublin?
Well, I think people are doing a great job at the moment, and that's through education. So there's lots of things going on. There's street stalls, there's school talks, videos are being produced, and that's the key to it. I'm a big fan of Donald Watson's idea of ripening up. He said we need to ripen people up to a new idea, and veganism is a new idea. That's one thing I think is important to say. People tend to think, well, we've been doing this vegan campaigning for so long, and we haven't got very far. That's not actually true. In fact, Ronnie Lee, the co-founder of the ALF, he's saying, well, look, when he went vegan, that was 1971, most of the people in the main groups weren't vegan. And so they didn't campaign about veganism, obviously. And then the concept of animal liberation through Singer and then with Reagan, that with animal rights, that came into vogue. And then a lot of the people who were running the national groups became vegans themselves. But that still didn't mean that they were campaigning about veganism, and the grassroots didn't either. It was all single issue, blood sports, anti-circus, this kind of thing, all kept in its little boxes.
Yeah.
So there was none of this kind of like modern day, interaction thing where people would openly say, veganism is our kind of moral baseline, that kind of idea. And I did hundreds of interviews in the 1980s. I don't really remember being asked about veganism particularly, and I didn't bring it up. If I was going to go there as an anti-blood sports person, I would talk about that, or if I was going to go there as an anti-vivisection, I would talk about that. But you wouldn't tend to kind of, make it more intersectional like we would now, And so we would also, we tended not to kind of incorporate human rights, but interestingly, most of the activists I knew in the 80s, they were involved with that. You would go on like a SAB at the weekend on a Sunday, then you would have a demo, and then you go to a Reclaim the Night, I think, then you go to Rock Against Racism gig. So I think people were a lot more political in those days. Even academics say that their students were more political in the 60s and 70s than they are now. I think. For me, that's a real shame.
Do you think single issue campaigns are a stepping stone to getting people to think about veganism? Yeah,
I think that. I think when you mention the word single issue, then the spectre, if you like, or the name of Gary Francione comes up. I think Francione's made a big mistake in the fact that he himself acknowledges sometimes that they can be abolitionized. And they can. In other words, they can be presented within an overall vegan framework. At the same time, he's very critical of them, and at the same time, the grassroots in particular, but also the national groups, they're very wedded to single issues. So there should be a compromise here. There should be a way of abolitionizing these things, because people want to do them, that's clear. People have done them for years and they still want to do them, and they will defend doing them. So I don't think it's good enough just to say this is a bad idea. I think what we need to do is veganize them, abolitionize them, and get people to alter their claims making. So rather than them talking about the circus, in Dublin, for example, there's often signs like, go vegan for all the animals at a circus demo, to put it into context. Because people come, I remember somebody drove up at a circus demo and go, oh, why don't you become vegetarians and we're vegans, and it kind of took their argument away from, because they thought that we were going to be single issue people, and they were then going to criticize us on the basis that we weren't more intersectional. So as soon as you say that, like when people come up to our stall, VIP stall, and they say, what's all this about? We don't do what is common, which is give a list of things we're against. We tend to give a list of things we're for, like we're for peace, we're for justice, we're for justice for all. We look at the scope of what justice means. We're for non-violence ultimately, and I think that kind of alters the conversation. Who could be against justice? So that immediately, if they're looking for an argument, you tend to kind of, defeat them in your opening statement, really.
Do you think like positive messages and approaches work better than like telling people that they're doing things wrong?
Well, I think psychologically, yes. Nobody, the interesting thing, I covered this in my PhD, the interesting thing is that when people, if you like, adopt the animal rights view of the world, they're effectively saying, hitherto I've been making error upon error upon error in a moral sense. I've been making a whole series of moral errors, and now I'm going to change, and until people will do that, then there's a problem. So if you call them names, I'm not quite sure if that's going to work, although of course, we all know kind of pithy kind of slogans, meat is murder and everything, but I don't know anybody who actually goes up to a meat eater and says you're a murderer, even if they adhere to the idea that meat is murder, And I think it's all about delivery, and it's all about being able to talk to people. It's about being educated yourself and being willing to be on the street talking to people, I think. And that part of veganism in Dublin, at least, but also probably elsewhere in Ireland, but in Dublin, that is well developed now, and I think it's doing well.
There seems to be like a lot of debates and would say maybe arguments on Facebook about what is the best approach or effective way to promote veganism. What's your opinion?
Well, I've got my general position is that if you want to do less than veganism, then kind of recruit the vegetarians and other people who do that, and then leave the smaller group of vegans to do that part of it, And so, what I object to currently is the idea of vegetarians in vegetarian organisations going around suggesting to people effectively not to be vegan on a kind of tactical level. Now, I tend to think, well, look, there are a few vegans already, and so there's, whenever I say to people, do you think there are more ethical vegans out there? They always say yes. And so, given that, I don't think there's anything more important than go and find them and get them as a part of our group. And I say ethical vegans because I know that's a controversial term, because ethical vegans equals vegans, really. It's just that we've got all this problem about, the definition is changing. Some people are trying to be more kind of tactical in terms of how to use it. There's been controversy about the Vegan Society slimming down the meaning of it and everything. And all that, I think, is a big shame. I tend to adhere to Steve Best's idea of alliance politics, although I would probably adhere to Tina Kubley's idea of a more kind of anarchist idea of we are each other. So, so the movement is intersectional in terms of its outlook. And then it's a question of, well, who do you make alliances with? What Best says is that we're a left-leaning group. Our values are left values, like democracy, like cooperation, like community, these kind of things. They're not right-wing values. And yet, the demographics of the movement is often right-wing. And so there's a big tension in the movement at the moment. There's a lot of racism in the movement. There's a terrible amount of sexism in the movement. And there's even some elements of fascism in the movement. And as Best says, these have got no place in our movement. We are a social justice liberation movement. These people have got no place, no part in our movement. They should be gone. And we shouldn't tolerate them.
Yeah.
And yet we do. Even organisations like in the shape of PETA, we tolerate sexism. You know, I mean, I couldn't believe it when not long after Obama was elected, I don't know if you know this, they did a demo dressed up as the Ku Klux Klan.
Wow.
I mean, talk about, you know, I mean, where do you go with that, you know? Yeah. I mean, that is just so tunnel vision without thinking at all.
So how do we promote intersectionality
Well,
in the movement?
It's interesting because like we recently changed our name to the Vegan Intersectionality Project, but we've been criticised for doing that, and people have asked us not to do that, and we've agreed to kind of do a debate about it because intersectionality has not gone down too well within and apparently without the movement. But within the movement, a lot of it is because you do have a lot of people who they just don't like humans, and they don't appreciate much human rights. Even though if you look at animal rights theory, that's built on human rights theory. I mean, our movement is an extensionist idea, you know. So rights started with, you know, white privileged men, but then the scope expanded. Our job is to get it over the species barrier, you know. And I would say the same about veganism, that, you know, the idea of veganism incorporated human rights originally. I mean, Donald Watson thought of it as the peace movement. You know, Leslie Cross said that it was to do with the moral evolution of humanity, or mankind, as he said at the time, product of the time. You know, and also Donald Watson said that veganism was the greatest cause of all. And I think what he was getting at there is that veganism could be an overarching kind of moral umbrella for everything else. So whether you're talking about anti-racism, anti-speciesism, even anti-capitalism, this kind of thing, anarchist threads could go in there. You know, there's a lot of potential for the what I call the expansive view of veganism is absolutely brilliant. You know, we ought to explore that. Yeah. At the moment, we're trying to squeeze it down, make it more sellable. Well, do we, you know, are we in the business of selling, or are we in the business of making change?
You mentioned quite a lot of issues and problems. Like, how do we focus on all of them all at once?
Well, because you could just do that within your claims making. It's not hard to talk about these things at once, because, you know, you can just talk about it. When people come up to the VIP stall, we talk about feminism, we talk about, you know, anti-racism, we talk about capitalism, you know, we talk about anarchy if they want to, we obviously talk about the animal issue, which is usually the thing that starts it. You know, what people need to understand is that the definition of veganism tends to talk about what I've tended to call human, non-human relations. But that's never been the scope of it. The scope has always been wider. It's always incorporated human rights. Talked about peace, as I said, even moral evolution, this kind of thing. And you'll see from the writing, you know, one thing that's a bit of a shame in a way is that Donald Watson got into a lot of issues about health. I mean, we're talking about 1944. They launched the Vegan Society in time of war, you know, and most people told them they were going to die, you know, and so consequently they had to spend a lot of time initially talking about health and the fact that people could actually be vegan in a dietary sense without dying. You know, that had to be part of their initial conversation. But even then, if you read what they said, it's clear they had a wider vision of that, even if they were kind of had to focus on that. And by the time we get to the 1950s, then people like Cross were going, well, come on, we're going to have to get a definition sorted out here. And when he talked about it, he definitely incorporated human rights, human evolution, peace, this kind of thing.
Sometimes it seems like there's a lot of males leading the movement when actually there's a lot more women that are in the movement as well.
Yeah, it's been an ongoing problem for a long time. You know, you can look back and see all the organisations, you know, who have been led, you know, sociologists call that, you know, prime mover. The prime movers in those organisations were women. You know, think about Animal Aid or NAVS, or, you know, in the British context, BOAV. But it is true, even Ingrid Newkirk, I suppose, in the States. But it is true in terms of writing that most of the well-known theorists, I guess, are men. So I think there's a problem there. I tend to, you know, wonder what happened to Joan Denea. You know, she wrote two particularly good books. Most people will probably remember Speciesism. This is only 2004. you know. But she's kind of out of the movement now. I think she was kind of driven out almost. So there is some issues. There are also some fundamental texts which were by women. You know, you got Animal Machines by Ruth Harrison and Silent Spring by Rachel Carson's. There's a few like that, and of course we've got people like Carol Adams with The Sexual Politics of Meat. You know, so female voices are not absent, but we all know that even in the, I mean, I know this as an academic, if you've got a seminar, often it's the male voices that prevail, and you know, you have to kind of manage that, and I guess maybe the movement hasn't managed it very well.
How do you think we can promote more females taking the lead?
Well, I think it's to do with not dismissing them on that grounds, obviously, and also through encouragement. But also, of course, there is maybe an essentialist argument, which is that, you know, women don't tend to want leadership roles. You know, I mean, I taught the sociology of humour. And men are much more likely to be the kind of centre stage kind of person, you know, puts themselves there in a bar and says, hey, I've got a joke, you know, kind of, they start to grandstand. But women tend to be not like that, a bit more collective, you know, men tend to kind of talk about canned jokes, you know, like a joke with a start, a middle and a thing, and then everybody got to laugh kind of thing, you know, aren't I great kind of thing. You know, women tend to tell stories. And so I think there is a kind of idea that women just work differently, whether collectively or individually, you know, and they don't push themselves forward as much. So whether it be good for men to not push themselves forward so much, or for women to start coming forward, I mean, that's an interesting feminist argument. You know?
Well, could you like maybe recreate the environments of like how people meet and organise themselves? Yeah,
well, that's quite good. I mean, I know our things are very kind of democratic. You know, VIP has definitely got more women involved than men. I was involved with some of the initial Irish DXE actions, and that was all women. You know, in fact, there was only one man, me, who was the camera person. I didn't do anything; I just filmed it, and it was completely women organised, women led, women run. Everything was done by women. You know, so I think we can probably forget that women take a big role. You know, you're a female filmmaker, and you're going around the world doing this. So that's, you know, it's easy to forget, and maybe men just get themselves on YouTube more often.
Why did you become vegan?
At the start, well, now we're going back to the 70s. I tend to remember. There's a few things. I tend to remember my sister was involved with things like the World Wildlife Fund, and I had this vision of a mantelpiece with envelopes on it, you know, the tiger appeal, the elephant appeal, and at the same time there was a scandal about the RSPCA, about the director or somebody spending what would now be millions on carpets for his office and this kind of stuff. So a bit of a financial scandal. So I tended to start thinking, where's all that money going? And then in 1977, I saw in a music paper an advert for the Hunt Saboteurs. And they weren't asking for money, they were asking for action. And that then, all those kind of ideas clicked with me, thinking, well, just get out there and do it. And so I became a SAB, you know. But very quickly after that, it expanded out to other things. You know, you would be given, you know, leaflets in the van, as it were, and stuff. And I was very lucky in a way, because I never went through a vegetarian phase. I know a lot of people say over and over, you just see it on Facebook, I regret the years that I was a vegetarian. And I never did that. So I kind of went from meat eating and everything else to vegan within about 3 months. And I was always very happy about that, you know. And looking back, you know, I tend to think I was lucky that, you know, I wasn't sucked into the vegetarian thing, you know. And also I think I had a strong sense of what was fair and what wasn't fair when I was a kid. You know, I do remember I used to go to school on the Isle of Wight, in a place called Ryde. And I do remember jumping from table to table, letting the wasps out that everybody else was trying to kill. So there was something in that, you know. I think there was something about fairness, And even in my first job, which was a projectionist, I remember being in the staff room and an usherette, there was a crane fly going up the walls, flying to long legs going up the walls like they do, and the usherette took her shoe off and bang, and said, "Oh, I hate them, they're so ugly." And I said, "Well, I think you're pretty ugly, but I wouldn't have done that," And so I just kind of thought, well, that's not fair, So I think there might have been some kind of strand of what's fair, which presumably came from my family somewhere, that initially informed it, and then it blossomed into what I am now, folks.
So do you have any tips for people that are thinking of going vegan?
Yeah, well, I'm obviously reading is good, and knowing the history of the movement is good. Knowing that there are different, views about it, but there's an expansive view and there's a limited thing. I would encourage people to explore the expansive view, which incorporates other liberation struggles and looks at justice for all. Something that is looking at a big thing, because we've got a big job to do here. I mean, even in kind of environmental terms, we're looking at the end of the planet, So veganism has got a lot to say about that, but also a lot to say about anti-racism, anti-sexism. It's because it's about justice. So veganism is bound to have a lot to say about those things. So don't limit it to diet. Don't limit it to just our relations with other animals. Think expansively about veganism. See it in the way that Donald Watson did, The Greatest Cause of All, as an umbrella thing. And once you start to look at veganism like that, it doesn't become a religion, it becomes an overarching philosophy for change and a tool for change. And that's how I would encourage people to start thinking about it.
That's great. Thank you, Roger.
You're welcome.